Philip and Ian, welcome. It's such a pleasure. Thank you for being here.
Happy to be back.
Thanks for having us.
I love that we're going to get to go deeper on this topic today because I feel like it's one that is still not very well understood in the world of health. And I've felt for myself just how impactful it can be. So it's one I'm very excited to keep learning. I know every time I see you both in person, I pepper you with questions. So today I just get to record that conversation. I would guess most people listening have at least heard of the term quantum energy at this point, but maybe don't have a firm grasp on what it is or how we interact with it. So to start pretty broad, I would love if you guys could give us some baseline understanding of what quantum energy is, and then we'll jump into talking how we can apply that to our lives.
Yes, certainly. So the energy behind the matter, that is what we call quantum energy. You can also call it source energy. It's literally everywhere behind the matter. Where we see matter or perceive matter, even our physical bodies, there's energy behind it. And I sometimes tell people, maybe I bridge that for you because you probably know that over 99% we're water on a molecular weight level. That is quite a bit of water within a body, but we don't really recognize that, right? We don't feel like that. We don't drive our cars and like, oh yeah, I'm just 99% water. But yet we are. And we are over 99% space, actually. And we also have heard that before. It's just we don't really know that. We don't think about that in our daily lives. That space is not empty space, though. It's not that there's just nothing. Or, well, it's a question of definition. You could certainly call it nothing, but it literally is quantum energy that is filling this space. And that energy is everywhere to some extent. Now, we've been able to harness and concentrate it in a fashion never done before so that you have a different concentration that you can tap into. So that's how I would explain it. You can also feel the energy if you just close your eyes and you feel beyond your physical body. You may feel your energetic bodies actually, and you may feel that there is energy. So it's something that you can also indeed sense rather than just understand with your brain.
Yeah, and jumping in just from my standpoint as sort of the scientist, quanta is it's the most complete and yet discrete particle of something, right? So a quanta of something is the smallest discrete particle that you can have. And as Philip said, we really are primarily space, 99.999% space. And, as it's a depressing thought, you guys have both heard me say this, anytime you think you're actually interacting and touching something, you exhibit solidity, but you're not actually solid. It's electron cloud repulsion. Your electron clouds are pushing on the electron clouds of the other object, and they're all humming around, probabilistically occupying a certain space. And that's what you're actually feeling. So we've developed this entire way of processing reality that, if you look at it from a scientific standpoint, isn't exactly representative of what reality is, but it's our perceived reality. And I think that's where a lot of the misunderstandings come from, is when you're doing something and you're ascribing quantum things to it. It's a little different because the lexicon isn't complete. Scientifically, it means one thing in terms of discrete particles, and in the sense that we use it, it's representative of the substrate beneath everything that exists. And so when we talk about it, we're aware that there is a slight discrepancy in the terminology, but that's because we're at the very forefront right now. This is kind of like when guys were starting to deal with electricity and magnetism, and Maxwell and those guys. They didn't have everything described. They could see the effects, which is a lot of what Philip and I have done. We can do randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials and elicit the same response every single time. We get the same things, and they're profoundly interesting and different, but we don't really have all of the terminology yet. As I joke, I don't have a quantumometer in the lab. The university where I do a lot of testing, that doesn't exist yet, right? I have gas chromatograph and liquid chromatograph and high performance liquid chromatography and all of the nuclear magnetic resonance, all of the things that we would have at the best of our capacity today scientifically. but basically that really kind of tells us what's inside the box, sort of. But then it really doesn't tell us how the stuff inside the box functions. Or you could say maybe it tells us what the box is, like the box is blue, but it doesn't tell us, is the box filled with lead or is the box filled with feathers? And there's a great disparity between those things. So we're kind of braving new territory. So when people get flustered with the term quantum in our space, a lot of times it's valid because people will, like, oh, new quantum breakfast pops. And it's not really something that adds to it. But I think over time, the work that we're doing and the way that we're approaching it very academically and very scientifically, really positing different questions and then going out and testing them, getting the data and refining it, over time, we'll start to develop a lexicon, and this will seem far more solid and concrete for the people who come after us.
Yeah, I find this whole realm so fascinating. And I know that many of the great minds of the past have had quotes along the lines of the future of medicine being in the realm of energy and frequency and vibration. And I feel like you guys are on the cutting edge of some of the applied ways that we're starting to see that. And I know for a lot of people, like I said, this is a hard concept to understand. And it's not one we encounter on Instagram as often as we might, like about how our food that we eat affects us or what clothing we wear affects our biology. But I know that there actually is, you mentioned double-blind studies that you guys have done on this, and I would love if you could delve into what we are learning about how this type of energy impacts our health, specifically in our bodies, and what we do know and or how we can measure it. I find this so fascinating, and I love always getting to hear from you guys about this.
Philip, why don't you
Sounds
jump in? Because the studies are so cool. I'm still, even though we've been doing them, I'm still kind of in awe of a lot of these things because it really does scientifically, it kind of cracks the paradigm that I was educated with. And it's funny to actually see that in practice in real time, like go, well, turns out we had an incomplete map of how this functioned. So
Yeah, so why don't I start with something very physical, actually, that Ian doesn't even know, and I wanted to update you on that. It's not a randomized double-blind study, but it's really cool because it's based on the zinc experiment that you had done at some point. So Ian had done a zinc experiment where he took zinc or with a professor together, and it was a stable zinc. And so they measured the redox potential. And then when they put it in the block for a few minutes and then they measured it again, it completely changed the redox potential, even though it was still the same substance. So very quickly you could tell, oh, well, the impact is clearly visible. Now, there's a chemist in Germany that we asked to replicate that. And if he could also test it with other substances, he now has tested 10 different substances, completely different substances. Even he tested even ibuprofen, right? And he's gone from literally this angle to that angle. And in every single case, the redox potential changes. And what's very interesting, what he found, and there's further research to be done, is that what we always knew energetically, that it optimizes the quality of a certain substance, that is what it does, because it doesn't just increase the redox potential, it actually does that based on the quality of the substance. So it could decrease or it could increase depending on what the quality of the substance is. And that is so cool to go in and actually physically measure that there is a change after you put it in, and actually an optimization, as it looks like, after you put it in the block. But now, of course, a lot of the listeners are like, okay, so what does that mean for me? Because I'm interested just in my health or the health of my children, and we're getting into that now. Because as a quick summary, because some listeners may not have heard previous podcasts and don't know about it, so we focused on a lot of different areas. And one reason is because there's institutes and labs and doctors' offices that often come to us and say, hey, have you tested this? Or possibly it could work with that. And or there's a customer that says, well, it helps with autism with our child. Someone reported it helps with autism, and then someone picks that up. And then in that case, it was a clinic in India that is specialized on autistic children, and they ran a clinical trial with 42 autistic kids, and they found a significant improvement across all, actually things that were measured, like attention span, language and speaking skills, focus, and so on. So that on average, the so-called PATIC score, which measures where a kid is on the spectrum, was reduced by 20 basis points within 6 months, which is absolutely significant. And if you're at 50 and below, you're actually not really on the spectrum anymore. So 20 basis points is massive. So that's just one little angle. We tested heart rate variability. We went into blood. So the dark field microscopy and live blood analysis studies that have been done in the US by Dr. Rubik, but also by the Base Institute in Austria, they found across the board that interestingly, in 100% of the cases, so not like 5% or 0.5%, like a pharmaceutical company would maybe test for some efficacy. No, in 100% of the cases, it was a significant improvement in the blood, in the red blood cells, so that blood even started to declot, reversal of stage 1 and stage 2 of blood clotting. White blood cell activity motility increases, which for the listener out there, what does that mean? That's, if your red blood cells are clotted, you're at high risk of stroke, heart disease, heart attack, and so on. It's just extremely unhealthy. You want blood to be flowing, to be very oxygenated. So that is extremely positive. That's what you want. And then the white blood cell activity and motility, that's important because your immune system doesn't function as it should if the white blood cells are paralyzed, as an example. Now, even further, something that, I haven't really reported on podcasts so far, because sometimes we want to be mindful and we want to also have enough data to talk about things. But the Base Institute in Austria found two additional things that are quite remarkable. One is that they found a reduction in parasitic load in the blood within a few minutes, right? So all of what I just said is that already happened within 10, 15 minutes of time. So that's very rapid. And so the parasitic load decrease that they found was, even in a best case that they found, was 80% within 15 minutes, 80%, 80. And right now they're going in basically and looking at all previous studies to specifically look into the parasitic load, because all of that was measured. It just was never a focus of the study, because the focus was always just to look at the red blood cells and the white blood cell activity. It wasn't parasitic load. But the pictures and videos, they're all still there, so it can be analyzed, and we'll soon know, in what range that is. My bet, if I were to bet right now, it's somewhere between 20 and 80% reduction in parasitic load. But let's see. That was the one thing that they found. The other thing was that the spike protein, traces of the spike protein, they found in a long-term 6-month study with 13 people in the control group and 13 people in the treated group. They found in all control group people, in every blood sample, no matter where in the body they took the blood, they found traces of the spike protein. In no one in the treated group, they were able to find traces of the spike protein. I don't want to go further into it, but I want to at least mention that because it's quite significant. And I think now, Ian, because you can maybe talk about the next one or the next two, because the last very physical ones in terms of studies were ATP production study done by Dr. Robert Schief, I think that's his name, at the University of Tulsa, that showed a significant improvement in ATP production, and then wound healing studies. Well, why don't you get into that? You can explain it better than I do.
Yeah, so with those particular studies, what we were looking at is cells in culture. So you put, you have a well plate and you fill it with hundreds of thousands of cells, and then you put a compound on them, cell titer glow, and you look at how much ATP is produced. And you only get a readout. You read it in a thing called a luminometer. Basically, you put it in in this case, it was called a citation 8, but you put it in and it reads the fluorescence coming off of the ATP that's produced. And it only fluoresces if ATP is produced. And so the granularity is incredibly specific. Like we can go down to, very, very, very precise units, 5, 6 decimal places in of how much ATP is actually being produced. And when we did this, normally you see cells just kind of have its term stochastic distribution, just kind of a random distribution of ATP output. Well, when we did this with the quantum upgrade, what actually happened was the cells that were in the control remained just stochastic distribution. Instantly, and I say instantly, within the first couple of minutes, all of the cells in the treated group, 100% across the board, jumped to between 20 and 29% output. And that is an anomalous result. That is not something that just happens, right? Every single one in the treated group, they all jump up, and everything in the control group remains exactly the same. So obviously it was having a pronounced impact. And what was the most intriguing for me about that particular study is the same thing that we did with the wound healing study, is it was blinded, right? So you guys, putting it in the system, we're basing that off of pictures that I took of only specific cell plates, and the professor who had actually plated them, we made sure that there was no crossover. So I would take the images and randomize them, and then I would, occlude them so that you couldn't see any markers on them. And then I would send you guys the images of just the ones that I had marked as being treated. So I was the only person who actually knew what was what, and then I would reveal it to the professor right before we did the analytics at the very end. And initially his response was funny because he was completely incredulous. He thought there would be no response whatsoever. And that's actually come to find, for me at least, and I think, Philip, we've talked about this, you kind of share the same view. The best people to do these things are the people who are skeptical, because at the outset they are looking for how it cannot work, right? Their mindset is that this is not only implausible, but fundamentally impossible, right? You can't affect the output of cell culture from hundreds of miles away in a blinded study where there is no contact. No one knows save the one person who's actually taking and processing the photos. It just seems tremendously implausible based on what we understand scientifically right now. But then when the data comes out and it happens consistently over and over and over and over, I think by the third time we did the experiment, uh, the professor was surprised, to say the least, and now talks to his class about quantum biology. He teaches senior level biochemistry, and all of his students are going off to medical school. And that's one of the things that's included now is, a discussion of the quantum effects of things. Because after you've seen it, if you're a reasonably good scientist and you're not just going the old school route of, well, it's not what I was taught, so it can't possibly be right, which historically that's kind of how science works, right? We push it forward, we do all the data. Some of us, myself included, very agnostically pull the thread. We get data that's anomalous, we pull the thread, we see where it takes us, and we don't really care where it takes us, especially if it takes us somewhere entirely new, because that's what we're supposed to do, right? We're the guys who are supposed to be advancing the field. And the way you do that is sometimes you look very silly and stupid because you have to recreate an experiment. And then when it is counter to what we have been taught previously, you have to put yourself in a defensible position where you have enough raw data that's really been thoroughly evaluated by your peers that you can say, okay, this is how it works. We don't quite understand it yet, but this is how it works. And that's what kept happening over and over. So after the third time, it was funny because he just kind of went, all right, well, I suppose, that makes sense. And so it was and he is truly, I've worked with him for years. He is an incredibly staunch skeptic with anything new and different in the lab. But that's terrific because you want that. And then after we did the ATP experiments, we moved on to wound healing. And the way you do the wound healing experiments is you take a plate, like a petri dish, and you put cells in this case, human dermal fibroblast, and you grow them to confluence, which just means that they coat the entire surface of the particular region that you're testing. Then you mechanically ablate a portion, and destroy the tissue in that section, and you take photos of it immediately thereafter, so you can see basically a channel that you've cut through the cells, which is representative of a cut in tissue because you're using human dermal tissue cells. And then you look at how long does it take for it to become confluent again. Basically, how long does it take for those components to thread back across as if a wound were being healed? And so the same thing applied. I would take the pictures, occlude the images so nobody could see which was which. And, Philip and his team remotely and the professor and his team here, no one had any clue until the very end. And we kept seeing the same thing where it was this insanely rapid pace, and the rapidity in some cases doubled. It was just something is broken and it repairs in half the time. And that was, to me, that was very profound, right? To look at it, because I knew from all of this stuff that there would be an effect. I did not think it would be quite as pronounced an effect. And in true professorly form, the professor said, well, this warrants further investigation, which is actually a huge step, because if you hadn't done just some outlandishly good result, they would go, well, this is, malarkey, just don't bother me again. But to say it warrants further investigation is kind of the equivalent of, was not expecting that. That's how that translates. And so that's where we are now. But for me, the most impactful component of all this, if you look at what we did, it demonstrably shows that not only are things connected through some medium, we can say whatever it is. For me, my guess is that the field, the quantum field, is an expression of consciousness. That's my particular take. And it's always evolving and developing based on what I'm seeing. But right now, that's where I think we are. But the thing that's so profound is, it's very obvious to me that everything, despite its own awareness, is connected. And so sending positive, intent to something from a remote location demonstrably shows results. It's almost as if you had good intent for people and did something about it, it would actually benefit them. Historically speaking, I think there may be some cultural things where people have done similar things over, I don't know, the past 6,000 years or so. But it's just funny to now actually quantify that and to put the science behind it to show that these things are in fact true and they are happening. And for me, it's exciting because that's the next level of what we're doing. Is we'll do these again and get more and more refined every time we do it, control for more and more and more variables. And that's why at the end of the day, I think we did the wound healing experiment 5 or 6 times. The very final experiments we were doing were very incredibly well controlled. We had taken out any variables that we could think of and, accounted for everything. And we were still getting the same, just honestly dumbfounding results. And so that for me, that's the kind of fun part about this, is being able to, even though I admittedly probably appear a bit daft to some, that's what happens when you're developing new technology, and when you're trying, or not developing, when you're describing new technology. Personally, I think these sorts of things have been there all along. And like you alluded to earlier, Philip, this is something that you've developed that's a new way to harness it that's never been done before. But the substrate of the energy that connects and binds all things together, a force, if you will, it's been there. Someone should write a movie and make lightsabers. So.
Well, I love that. And I'm no medical researcher, though I would say I probably have spent more time than the average person in PubMed and reading studies. And the results you're talking about, like you said, are substantial and not what we normally see in studies at
No.
all, and really striking. And especially that you've been able to replicate it in different areas. I know the spike proteins and clotting is something that's top of mind for a lot of people right now, but HRV and ATP production are massive. Those are like ripple effect areas when it comes to health. And so I love that you really delved into those. I know this concept might still be hard to grasp, but Ian, you mentioned at a distance. And I would love if you could give us a little bit of the science behind how we think we understand this can work at a distance. I feel like that is often the obstacle for people to grasp, is how can this work if it's not in immediate proximity to someone?
So one of the previous Nobel Prizes that was awarded for physics a couple years ago was about quantum entanglement. And there's sort of a misnomer when people discuss quantum entanglement. They say two things are connected remotely at distant points and affect an impact on the other. Well, it's actually what happens when you entangle something. They really aren't two things. It's one thing, right? So they are one discrete unit. They have become one waveform, if you will. So if you push on one end, the other end moves, irrespective of distance, right? And so that's the thing that throws us, is we are very tangible and spatial creatures. You know, I'm sitting in a chair, you are sitting in a chair over there. My chair is solid, your chair may be squishy. We're very tactile. But as it turns out, that really isn't how the universe works, because it's not the most efficient way. And lo and behold, the universe is actually doing it better than we are. Not shocking, you know, nature always wears it best. But the idea of entanglement, when two particles entangle and become one thing that's entangled, space ceases to be an issue, and things are literally entangled at a distance. So in the case of this, what is very clearly demonstrable is that these particles exhibit those properties. I'm not saying that they're entangled, because we didn't go through the normal process that one would to entangle particles, right? You'd quantize something, you'd entangle it with lasers or something like that. We didn't do any of that. And again, that's impactful to me, because one of the things that tells me is that these are obviously expressing some of the, you know, the more visible tenets of what it means to be entangled, but we haven't done anything to entangle them. And it makes me kind of posit the idea that, well, what if everything is actually entangled at its base, right? What if we just have this amazing ability to see things as if they're separate, even though they perhaps aren't separate? And that's why it's so impactful to me, is I look at this and I realize, and I've said this before in lectures, after doing this experiment and doing these sorts of experiments in a whole, I walked away going, you know, the very first time we did this, I was kind of dumbfounded by it. And I thought, God bless, you know, I need to explain to people, be kind, right? You may not think that the waveforms that you propagate have an impact, but they do, right? The fact that someone is looking at your image means that there is a transmission of the waveform that is Katie, and I'm perceiving it, you know, at a distance remotely right now. And the way you smile and the way you look, that has an impact on me. And so it should not really be that far a reach to think that, well, perhaps there's, you know, some other sort of waveform dynamic that we haven't really defined yet, that really does actually bind and connect everything. And these experiments actually would point us in that direction, to say that everything is entangled and all of these things are functioning that way. We just don't see it. We are actually, our consciousness, in my estimation, is what blocks us off and allows us to perceive both the passage of time and the persistence of a spatial environment. And those things, after doing these experiments, seem less real, right? It seems like something that we perceive, but is less the reality of how things are. So.
Yeah, this whole world is so fascinating to me. And I know, to me, it's most exciting when applied. And I've both firsthand experienced the difference in this, and also been with you guys at events where people come up to you to tell you unprompted about the difference that they have felt. So I would love to spend the rest of the time for this particular episode really delving into that. Like, what physical and or other health challenges are you guys sort of aimed at helping people with, and or maybe share a little bit of these incredible stories, because I know you guys must get so many. I've heard them even just standing next to you when you go places, but the effect can be really profound. So I would love to delve into that.
Yeah, so we always need to be a little bit mindful of not speaking about a specific disease or health condition, obviously, just because of regulatory issues. So we always try to navigate around that, and we also try to have the studies not be done, you know, with sick people that all have cancer, for example, so that we don't even get in there. You know, that's not really the playing field. I think it's all about general health and wellness, and there's amazing research. Now, frankly, I mentioned this study with the autistic kids, and yeah, that is a condition. Now, that was done in India, though, clinical study in India, and I mentioned that because, you know, it wasn't done here; it was done there. But now, the most recent example, right at the biohacking conference last week, a lady walked up to the booth and she hugged me. And now that she was not the only one that hugged me, but that was like an incredible story. because she said, I have a kid, and he's 17 years old. He's autistic. And for the last 6 years, he's been regularly IQ tested. And he was always on a third grade IQ level, always, over and over again. Then she started using our technology for him, in this case, the quantum upgrade. And she used it, I think it was about 2 months. And then they did an IQ test again. And for the first time ever, he's at a sixth grade level. That is 3 grades. And of course, that is nothing placebo controlled, blinded, whatever. That's a personal experience. You can call it anecdotal, but it is these personal stories that actually, I think, make up for the community that we have, that is very unique, that stands behind these products. Because most of those people that witness that firsthand, such a significant change, they're touched in their heart, and they don't need any studies. They're just thankful that this is there, and they get it. Because there was nothing else she did with her son, who's 17 years old. And certainly that son also wasn't really aware that something was happening. That is quite significant. So that makes my day if I hear something like that. And of course, we have a lot of stories. I don't know, we have way over 1,000 testimonials about physical things that change significantly, and also allergy and food sensitivity related things that people report, whether it is someone that could never tolerate a lemon, and then heard about this experiment that we did live on stage at Dave's conference a few years ago with the crab meat. For people that don't know, you can still look it up on YouTube, where crab meat was put in the arm of Todd Shipman, who's allergic to it, instantly got red and started to develop these almost blister type spots on the skin. It was very itchy. The same crab meat they put live on stage in our Infinity block. After charging that, Ian put it in his other arm, and there was no allergic reaction, right? So now this person heard about this and other stories, and we tell people to not do it at home, by the way, right? So because that's for us difficult to do. We can't recommend that yet, because there's too many different allergies, types of allergies, substances, and all of that. It would frankly not be a good thing if we recommended that, but there's people that still try it. Now, that person did it with a lemon. For his whole life, he couldn't. And then he charged the lemon and he could tolerate it. No issue whatsoever. And that's not like, we hear this over and over again across all kinds of different substances. And that's very special. I think in our Telegram communities, we have 3 different, now it's actually 4 different communities for the different products, and also different languages. This is all for people. These are private, right? So we don't want any bots there. We also don't want any people there this is not to inflate any numbers. This is just a spot where people can interact, that are real, that have real interest, that are using the products so that they can share and learn information. And we have about 10,000 people across the board now in all these groups. And if you go there, you hear just all these stories of what people found out and what they have encountered. It's heartwarming sometimes, and that's why we do this, frankly. This is and that's also why we do the research, right? Some of the research we come up, oh yeah, we could test that, and that would be great to test and figure out. But often it's because the community says, we found that it works with this, and we found that it works with that. Do you know what we're going to test next, by the way? Now, this is not really health related, but a guy walked up to me at the Barracan conference right after my presentation and said, you know what? The travel block that I've been loving, I put it in my Tesla, right where the charging plug is. And now I get 10 to 15% more mileage out of it. And I know I'm not a study. It's just me doing this, but I'm driving exactly the same. There's something to it. Could you look into this further? Like, Sure, why not? You know, this is how we hear about new things that people find out, and then we try to facilitate more research.
That's so fascinating. And to your point, I know people always want to hone in on the double blind controlled randomized studies, but also I remind people an N of one study, if the N is you, is actually the most powerful data you will ever have because it's in relation to you. And so I love that you hear that from so many people. And I have a Tesla as well. So I'm actually very curious to try that. And I'll report back my results as well.
Please.
You mentioned the products a little bit in these explanations, but I feel like it's worth also, can you give us an explanation of what the different options are and kind of what you recommend them for? What would be the best use cases for someone, especially in a family setting, who wanted to try this and experience it for themselves? What are the options that you have available and how can they best be integrated?
Yes, so we have Lila Quantum Tech that has actual physical products. That's, you know, all of those products, they help mitigate the negative effects of EMF. And they do some of these amazing things that we just talked about and more. We have these blocks. Now, actually, my phone here right now sits on the block that I would show you otherwise, but I can't do that right now. These are the actual like quantum energy generators, you could call them. And that's where you indeed create a space where distance and time doesn't really matter. And you have all these incredible effects. Then we have some other products like the so-called Heal Capsule that just won the Dragonfly Health Innovation Award, which is charged with specific frequencies that are helpful for the human body, water bottles, and so on. That's all physical. And then we also have something called Quantum Upgrade, which is actually, you find it on quantumupgrade.io. I always say that because it's not on .com, it's on .io in this case. And that works completely remotely over distance. That is also the service that we applied for the latest, wound healing studies, where I mentioned, this was a long distance away from the actual cells that were treated. So that is something you can try for free, and I find it personally extremely powerful and versatile. But what you cannot, so that's for you personally or for your home or for your business or your pet, frankly. What you cannot do with that is you could not charge physical substances. You could not charge water. You could not charge, your raspberries or your crab meat. So if you wanted to do something like that, then you would need to have a physical product. So that's where I think the main difference comes in. They overlap in some of what they can do, the service and the physical products, but then they actually really have different use cases too. And Ian, feel free to jump in here.
Yeah, with regard to those, I do think the use cases are a little different. I actually am kind of partial to the infinity blocks and just the old school quantum blocks because I've noted differences in them. The old original quantum block with the single plate top and bottom is very good for copying frequencies and replaying a frequency into something else, which is kind of a fascinating thing because when you look at an object, most people look at an object and just assume that it's that thing. Because of the work that we've done, I look at an object and realize that there are, as best that I can discern at this point, I can isolate 20 different components that describe that in terms of, they have chirality, there's a waveform coming off of it. It has all these different, very intricate layered pieces that make a thing a thing. And when you realize that you can modulate individual components of that, it gets kind of fun because you can tinker with it, right? You can take, in one of the cases that I know we've talked about, you can take something like sage and leave it in a block and then put milk in the block in a glass afterwards. And then the milk will literally taste and smell like sage. And for anybody who is curious about that, there's a book that used to be required reading for the biochem class that I taught, and it was for seniors at a university. And basically, it was a book called Life on the Edge, and it was about quantum biology. And one of the more interesting experiments that has been done really pretty conclusively shows that what I was taught, what I used to teach is basically wrong about in terms of, you have a lock and key mechanism that determines how things smell, and it's a binding factor. Yeah, that does appear to happen, but it's actually a downstream effect. It's more of a tertiary effect, not even a secondary, effect. It's really based on vibration. So gustation, the sense of taste, and olfaction, the sense of smell, are really functions of vibration. And if you read that book, it's a really good book. It goes into the experiments that they've drilled down on, and so I kind of like tinkering with those things. And you can do it with the blocks more effectively. The quantum upgrade is great if you want to have a specific person covered or a specific place covered. But for me, being the ever tinkerer scientist, I like the old school blocks because I get to noodle around with them and do crazy stuff and see what's what.
And I'll say I use all of the things you guys just mentioned. I'll put links in the show notes to all of them as well. I find that the blocks and the capsules are great conversation starters as well. And the last question for this episode, we're going to get to do a whole nother one on EMFs, which I'm really excited for. But you guys both use the term charge, and this is such a daily part of my life. But I realize some people listening might not have a concept for what you mean by when you say you charge something in the block. So can you briefly explain that?
Yeah, so that's a great question because sometimes we tell people, hey, you can charge your phone here at our booth, just put it in the block. And some people really think it's then battery charging it, but that's not what's happening. So in these blocks, there's a super concentrated quantum energy field, right? And by the way, you can think of like what happens when you have two strong magnets, one in your left hand, one in your right hand, and then at some point you come together, and then at some point you feel this field, this force in between these magnets, right? That's pretty much what's going on in between the plates of the blocks. Just it's not magnetism, it's actual quantum energy, but it's a very, very strong force. And we can't necessarily feel directly physically, but indirectly very, very well. Now, because of the nature of that field, if you put a substance in or any object, it is because the quantum energy is the most fundamental layer of energy, it goes through it. It literally almost like sieves through it so that the vibration of the object or of the substance is enhanced, it's increased. So that is pretty much what's happening there. And that's what we call charge. When you charge the water, means then that's what the Emoto Institute in Japan found, right? So they tested water. They have their control group water, and then they put the water in the block and see that within just a few minutes, suddenly the water gets structured and becomes beautiful. That out of one beautiful crystal that they were able to show in the control group, there were 5 beautiful crystals suddenly. That is the charging. That is what I mentioned initially, where if you put zinc in there, something changes. The quality of whatever you put in is enhanced. That is what we mean by charging.
And I'm going to add to that. I remember very distinctly, it was February of 2022 when I did the experiment with the zinc, and I also did vitamin C and a couple of others. When I got the data back, it blew me away because it is a definitive difference. I remember that the colors on the lines for the zinc experiment were orange and blue. And when I initially ran them for redox, they were so overlapped that I actually had to zoom in to be able to see that the orange and blue line were it perfectly layered over one another. And then after putting one in a block and then rerunning it against the original was exactly where it was, and the blue line was in an entirely different position. And again, this goes back to my kind of assessment of technologically where we're at. We can tell you what color the box is, but we can't necessarily tell you what's in it. And very definitively, there is a huge difference in terms of how those things interact. And I would say that the term charging is a really good way to put it, because I had noticed this too, and it's great to hear that the other chemist had done the same thing. it was strange because it wasn't a unidirectional function. It wasn't like the redox potential always increased. It varied. And to your point, Philip, to the betterment of what would actually be better for a person, which is, again, it goes back to that idea that there's obviously some sort of underlying intelligence to all of these things, because the idea that out of 5 or 6 different substances that I did and this other fellow did 10, and I'm excited to see that stuff, but the idea that it would always coincide with what is most beneficial for us, that's a bit of a stretch for me, right? Like, that's not random. It's just like with Todd Shipman on stage with the crab meat and the juice from it. It triggered a mass histamine reaction initially, but then when we put it in and charged it in the block, it changed something. Now, we don't know precisely what it is, but I would posit that in the waveforms that actually make that up, you're not actually having a histamine reaction because you're having a biochemical problem. You're obviously, since we know we can do this repeatedly, you're having a waveform interaction, because you as a person are a waveform, and you're interacting negatively with something else. So there's a destructive interference pattern that forms. The charging, to me, is you're taking the components that would make something destructive for you as a being and simply modulating some, so that rather than destructive interference patterns, it's constructive interference patterns, or a negation of the destructive interference pattern. So the charge is, it becomes suddenly beneficial for you as a person. And that's what you're left with, is that substance, but in a way that's more appropriate for you as a person individually. And that's honestly the amazing part, is for you as an individual.
It's so fascinating and definitely an area I hope to continue to learn from both of you on. Like I said, it's a part of my life already, but I'm excited to understand it more and more as we all get to learn more. But for this episode, I'm so grateful for both of your time, and so grateful that you'll get to join for the next episode we're going to record that will go deep on the EMF topic. But for now, for this one, thank you guys so much for being here and for all that you've shared.
Thanks, Katie.
Thanks so much.
See ya.
And thank you for listening. I hope that you will join me again on the next episode of the Wellness Mama podcast.